Welcome to a journey into one of the most unsettling cases in Arkansas history. Before we begin, take a second to drop in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time of day or night you're listening. It's always fascinating to see where these stories travel. Today, Jasper, Arkansas is a quiet mountain town tucked away in the Ozarks, a place where neighbors wave on Main Street and travelers stop for gas. But back in 1920, this same town found itself at the center of a mystery that would linger for decades. 6 miles northwest of Jasper, on the Coones property, along what is now County Road 74, events unfolded that no one at the time could fully explain. On Sunday, October 17, 1920, the bell of Jasper's First Methodist Church rang as usual, calling the congregation inside. But that morning, one seat was empty. Ezra Coones, a 47-year-old farmer known for his reclusive habits but flawless church attendance, was missing. For the first time in 2 decades, his name did not appear in the pews. Reverend Thomas Whitfield even scribbled a quick note in the margin of his sermon outline, "EC absent, unusual." When Ezra failed to collect his mail midweek or make his usual Wednesday stop at Wilson's General Store, concern deepened. Sheriff Milton Pewitt rode out to the Coones property, and what he discovered there sparked more questions than answers. For the next half-century, whispers, rumors, and strange claims would shadow this case long after officials had closed it, with the unsatisfying conclusion, whereabouts unknown, presumed dead. The farm itself stretched across about 85 acres, mostly wild woods with 20 or so cleared for crops. A sturdy oak and pine house overlooked the Buffalo River. A leaning barn sagged nearby, and a root cellar cut into the hillside was locked with a shiny new padlock that stood out against the weathered landscape. What made Ezra's disappearance truly chilling wasn't only that he vanished, but the strange things found inside the house. The clashing stories from those who knew him, and the bizarre experiences later reported by anyone who lived on or investigated the land. By 1968, during courthouse renovations, forgotten boxes marked Coones 1920 turned up in the Newton County Courthouse attic. Inside were photos, interview transcripts, and personal belongings that painted a picture far more complicated than the official record. Combined with letters, diaries, and interviews collected years later by local historian Martha Burrows, these discoveries suggested the case was never what it seemed. Ezra's story doesn't just trace the steps of a missing man. It drags us into the heavy silence of a family that kept to itself, into the loneliness of mountain isolation, and into the shadows of secrets that refused to stay buried. The Coones family had always been small and private. County records show that Ezra's father, Jeremiah, arrived in Newton County in 1891 with his wife Sarah and teenage Ezra. They bought the land from a banker after the previous owners left, suddenly under suspicious circumstances. According to local lore, they fled in such haste that furniture, clothes, and even supper still sat waiting on the table. And so the Coones property became a place marked by sudden absences, uneasy inheritances, and a legacy of unanswered questions. Jeremiah Coones was remembered as a stern but even-handed man, someone who kept his faith but rarely involved himself in the life of the town. His wife Sarah was even more withdrawn, described by neighbors as quiet to the point of near invisibility. A doctor's journal from 1897 noted her bouts of melancholy and prescribed drops of laudanum to help her sleep. She died 2 years later of what the doctor publicly called a wasting illness, though he privately suspected tuberculosis. After her passing, Jeremiah and his son Ezra worked the land together until 1907, when Jeremiah collapsed in the fields from heart failure. Ezra, then 34, inherited the farm and carried on alone. Despite the hardships of solitary life, Ezra built a reputation as both a farmer and handyman. He maintained the property, sold small amounts of surplus at market, and often hired himself out for carpentry or repair jobs. Thomas Wilson, who ran the general store in Jasper, recalled in a 1945 interview that Ezra was dependable and skilled, always paying his debts in cash, though he never once saw him smile. Few people knew that Ezra had gone further in school than most boys in rural Arkansas, completing the 10th grade in Harrison with top marks in mathematics and natural sciences. A teacher's note described him as unusually bright, socially distant, and fascinated by subjects like geology and astronomy that weren't part of the curriculum. That sense of isolation deepened on the family farm. The nearest neighbors, the Hargroves, lived nearly 2 miles away. Eliza Hargrove remembered Ezra doing carpentry work for her father, but admitted she found him unsettling. She recalled an incident in 1917 when he arrived at their door before sunrise, claiming he had walked all night after seeing strange lights in the woods near his farm. Her father dismissed it as foxfire or fireflies, but Ezra insisted the lights moved with intention. For all his eccentricities, Ezra lived by habits that everyone in Jasper knew. Every Wednesday afternoon, he collected his mail, bought supplies at Wilson's, and sometimes stopped at the barber. Every Sunday, he attended church, sitting quietly in the same pew before slipping out as soon as the service ended. He never married, had no close friends, and confided in no one. The last time anyone saw him was Wednesday, October 13th, 1920. Wilson's ledger shows purchases of staples like coffee flour, salt kerosene, and unusually 3 boxes of .30-30 rifle ammunition, weeks ahead of the hunting season. Postal records confirm he collected 2 items that day, his usual farm newsletter and a letter from St. Louis with no listed sender. After that, Ezra Coones simply vanished. When Ezra Coones stepped into the Jasper post office on October 13, 1920, he did not behave like his usual quiet self. Clarence Jenkins, who worked the counter that day, later told historian Martha Burrows that Ezra looked nervous, almost jittery. Instead of tucking his mail away as he normally did, he ripped open the letter from St. Louis right there in front of him. Jenkins remembered how Ezra's hands trembled as he read the page twice over. When Jenkins asked if everything was all right, Ezra muttered, "It's confirmed then," and walked out without another word. At Wilson's general store, Ezra acted just as strangely. Grace Wilson recalled him standing before the large county map on the wall, staring for nearly 20 minutes. She heard him mumbling about northern boundaries and convergence points ideas he had never mentioned before. When she asked if he needed directions, he snapped out of his trance and returned to his shopping. The barber, Samuel Ritter, gave perhaps the most unsettling account. Instead of asking for his regular trim, Ezra requested a mirror so he could inspect the back of his neck. Ritter remembered the farmer twisting and straining, insisting something might be wrong there. Ritter assured him all he saw was the birthmark Ezra had always carried. Ezra seemed relieved, but made a bizarre request. "If it changes, if it starts to look different, you tell the sheriff right away." Ritter admitted in later testimony it was the strangest moment of his 30 years behind the chair. When Sheriff Milton Pwitt finally rode out to the Coones homestead on October 21st, the farm looked deceptively calm. The front door was unlocked, the kitchen table held a half-full cup of cold coffee, and a chair sat pushed back as if Ezra had just stepped outside for a moment. His Winchester rifle was missing, but his coat still hung by the door. It was in the bedroom that Pwitt found something truly unnerving. The bed neatly made, and on top of it, a figure constructed from clothes, complete with boots at the foot and a hat at the head, arranged to mimic a sleeping man. Next to this eerie display sat a small wooden box filled with folded papers, which the sheriff collected. Outside, the animals were cared for. The mule fed the chickens tended, which suggested Ezra had not simply abandoned the farm. But when Pwitt opened the root cellar, he uncovered something no one in Newton County expected. Hidden behind rows of preserved food was a narrow door scarcely 3 feet high. It led into a cramped chamber, 8 by 10 feet, outfitted with a table chair and walls covered in clippings, letters, and hand-drawn maps. Deputy Vernon Ellis photographed the strange room layers of paper tacked onto rough wooden boards. Sketches of the surrounding hills and correspondence pinned like evidence in some private investigation. On the table sat a kerosene lamp and a leather-bound journal, which Puig logged into evidence. The discovery of the hidden chamber raised more questions than answers. County building records confirmed the cellar had been dug years before the Coones family bought the property, suggesting that Ezra had inherited not just the land, but also its secrets. Whatever compelled him to spend nights poring over maps and newspaper clippings remained locked in those papers and in the final days leading up to his disappearance. The discovery of the hidden chamber left investigators wondering whether Ezra had stumbled upon an older secret or whether he had crafted the room himself. The cellar's narrow passage and aged support beams suggested it predated his ownership, built decades earlier, with more care than mere food storage required. Its wooden flooring stood in stark contrast to the packed earth of the main cellar, as though whoever constructed it intended it for more than practical use. Ezra's leather-bound journal, covering the 21 months before his disappearance, painted a haunting picture of a mind unraveling. At first, his notes were plain and routine entries about the weather chores and his occasional errands in Jasper. But by early 1920, his handwriting grew more erratic and his thoughts turned unsettling. On February 12th, he recorded measuring his boundary stones and finding them inexplicably shifted, insisting the distances had changed without natural cause. In May, he described nights disturbed by tapping inside the walls, a rhythm too precise to be mice or insects, which he likened to coded signals. By June, the journal reflected a man convinced he was being watched. He wrote about deliberate footprints near his well, unlike any animal tracks. By September, Ezra admitted to abandoning his bed for the hidden chamber, claiming it was safer. He referred to old symbols father carved on the cellar walls, which he believed could slow down whatever forces threatened him. His final entry, scrawled on October 12th, the day before his last trip to town, was chillingly brief. "It's in the walls." The clippings plastered on the hidden room's boards showed that Ezra was not just fearful, but also obsessed. He had collected decades' worth of reports on disappearances and strange deaths across Arkansas and neighboring states. Many bore his annotations, linking them into a repeating pattern often tied to the month of October. One article from 1899, the year his mother died, recounted the disappearance of a trapper named Elias Whitby, who had spoken of unusual findings in a cave north of Jasper before vanishing. Ezra's note beside it read, "Mother knew him. Said he visited father once." What did they discuss? Another clipping from 1907, the year Jeremiah Coones collapsed in the fields, described a bizarre, circular depression near Fayetteville. Scientists had called it karst activity, but Ezra scrawled in the margins, "Same as father found. Not natural." His fixation stretched further through letters exchanged with an elusive figure identified only as ERM in St. Louis. These correspondences, spanning 1918 to 1920, spoke cryptically of the phenomenon and compared observations from other states. They hinted at a network of watchers and researchers, but never explained what exactly they feared. By the time of his disappearance, Ezra appeared convinced he had inherited not just land, but an old and malignant secret, one tied to his family, to the strange chamber under his cellar, and to a pattern of October vanishings that had haunted the Ozarks for decades. The final known correspondence Ezra received, postmarked October 10th, 1920, came from the enigmatic RM in St. Louis. It carried a warning that now feels chilling in hindsight. Do not attempt further investigation alone. Will arrive by month's end. Tell no one. That letter was almost certainly one of the 2 pieces of mail Ezra collected on his last recorded trip to town. Investigators never uncovered the true identity of RM. The return address linked to the Midwestern Society for Geological Research, a small private group based in St. Louis. By 1921, barely a year after Ezra's disappearance, the society dissolved, leaving nothing behind but unanswered questions. Of all the items found in Ezra's secret chamber, Deputy Vernon Ellis privately admitted that one object disturbed him most. In his personal notes later unearthed by historian Martha Burroughs, he described a leather pouch tucked in the corner of the room. Inside were human teeth, at least 3 sets confirmed by a state laboratory in Little Rock. Yet this evidence never appeared in the official file. When Burroughs questioned Ellis decades later, he denied ever having seen such a pouch, despite his earlier written account. With no body and no definitive signs of foul play, Sheriff Milton Puig had little choice but to treat the case as a missing persons investigation. A search party combed the Coones property and surrounding wilderness on October 24th, scouring the riverbanks and forest trails. They found nothing of Ezra or his missing rifle. One man, Luther Holcomb, claimed he had discovered strange markings carved into trees near the property's northern boundary. They looked like letters, though not in English or in any language he recognized. When he returned the next day with a deputy, the carvings had vanished, and Holcomb swore the landscape itself looked altered. Puig dismissed the account as a case of mistaken location, but the story spread quickly, feeding local suspicion that something stranger was at work. Then came the fire. On November 2, 1920, less than 3 weeks after Ezra was last seen, the Coones homestead went up in flames. Neighbors spotted it too late. By the time they arrived, the house had already collapsed into glowing embers. The cause was officially left undetermined, perhaps an overturned kerosene lamp, though some whispered about arson. James Hargrove, who fought the blaze, later described it in words that still trouble researchers. He claimed the flames burned with an eerie blue-white glow and made a low humming sound that set his teeth on edge. Curiously, the fire spared the root cellar and the hidden chamber beneath. Yet when authorities returned, the walls were bare. Every clipping and letter had been stripped away. Even Ezra's journal previously logged into the sheriff's office as evidence was gone. When Burroughs pressed Ellis about this decades later, he insisted the materials had been forwarded to the state capitol for study, though no official record of their transfer or return has ever surfaced. What remained was a smoking ruin, a vanished farmer, and a growing cloud of contradictions that ensured the Coones case would never truly close. The contradictions surrounding Deputy Vernon Ellis only deepened the mystery of Ezra Coones' disappearance. Though Ellis claimed the seized papers and Ezra's journal had been forwarded to the state capitol, official records showed no receipt of such evidence. Even more suspicious, Ellis resigned from the sheriff's office in December 1920, barely a month after Ezra vanished, and abruptly left Newton County. By 1923, he was working nights as a watchman at an Oklahoma oil field. When historian Martha Burroughs tracked him down in 1950, he was living in Tulsa, plagued by nightmares, and described by his landlady as a man who feared the dark. That same December, the county began probate proceedings for Ezra's estate. With no heirs on record, the farm was expected to revert to the state. But on December 18th, a stranger appeared in Jasper. He introduced himself as Robert Marshfield of St. Louis and claimed to be Ezra's second cousin, presenting documents that Judge William Hargrove accepted as proof of kinship. Marshfield was tall, sharply dressed, and spoke with what locals described as an Eastern accent. Though the papers looked old, Burroughs later found troubling irregularities. The ink and paper on the family Bible's Coones branch entry didn't match the rest of the volume, and Tennessee church records from Ezra's birthplace contained no trace of the lineage Marshfield described. Despite the doubts, Marshfield took possession of the land. He hired local men to clear the burned ruins of the Coones house and build a smaller cabin. But he showed an obsessive interest in the root cellar. Workers recalled him ordering extensive digs around the chamber, sometimes 6 feet deep, and carefully collecting soil in small glass jars. By February 1921, Marshfield abruptly sold the property at a loss to rancher Henry Gladwell and disappeared from the region. Burroughs' research later uncovered a death certificate for a man by that name in Philadelphia, dated October 17, 1925, 5 years to the day after Ezra's disappearance was first recorded. The cause was listed as acute respiratory failure due to trauma. Coroner's notes described strange injuries along the neck and spine, unlike anything typical of accident or assault, and noted that the body was already in a state of decay, inconsistent with the supposed time of death. Gladwell, who purchased the Coones land, never lived there. He used it only for cattle grazing, leaving the Marshfield-built cabin empty until 1927, when he hired a caretaker, Vincent Holloway. At first, Holloway described the farm as quiet though lonely in letters to his sister in Little Rock. But within a year, his tone shifted. In August 1928, he wrote of strange happenings, noting that the cattle refused to graze in the North Field. No matter how green it gets, he said they just stand at the fence line and bellow. Holloway's words marked the beginning of a new chapter in the property's dark reputation, as the land itself seemed to resist the lives placed upon it. Vincent Holloway's letters took a chilling turn in the fall of 1928. He wrote of hearing movements inside the walls of the cabin at night, a scratching and shifting that no amount of trapping explained. Mr. Gladwell thinks it's raccoons, Holloway told his sister. But I've set traps and found nothing. By September, his curiosity pushed him to investigate the remains of the old root cellar. Though most of it had collapsed, a section of the hidden chamber survived. On the support beams, he found strange carvings, patterns and shapes unlike initials or dates, more like writing from an unknown system. He noted their similarity to markings he had seen carved into old trees farther north. In October, his letters described even more unsettling discoveries. At the northern edge of the property, Holloway found trees marked with symbols not resembling any rancher's brand, yet deliberate and precise. He sketched them for his sister. Decades later, Burroughs showed the drawings to a University of Arkansas linguist, who concluded they bore faint resemblance to native pictographs, but matched no specific tribal record. Stranger still, he pointed out their likeness to symbols unearthed at ancient Missouri sites, predating known settlements by centuries. Holloway's last letter, dated October 15, 1928, contained his boldest plan yet. He had found a depression in the ground, north of the cabin, a perfect 6-foot circle of oddly soft soil. He suspected it might be the beginning of a sinkhole concealing a cave system. If there is a cave system down there, he wrote, it could explain some of the sounds I've been hearing. Sound carries strange ways underground. He intended to explore it the next day, bringing along his new camera to document what he found. He was never heard from again. On October 18th, when Holloway failed to collect supplies, and Jasper Gladwell sent 2 men to check on him. They found the cabin neat and undisturbed, his coat and boots still inside. But there were odd details, a sharp smell in the air like lightning had just struck, and dark marks on the floor, suggesting something wet had been dragged from the bedroom toward the door. A full search 2 days later, led by Sheriff Leland Puit, the son of the original investigating sheriff, covered the property and the depression described in Holloway's letter. They found the soil had sunk deeper, about 18 inches across the circular patch. But there was no evidence of tunneling or collapse. No trace of Holloway was found. What they did recover was his camera dangling from a tree branch 50 yards from the depression. The developed film showed 5 clear shots of the circular sinkhole from different angles. The 6th exposure, however, was a ruined blur. The technician who processed it described it as wildly overexposed with no discernible subject. That final photograph vanished from the file and has never been located. The disappearance of Holloway almost exactly 8 years after Ezra Coones shook the community and reignited suspicion that the property carried a curse. Sheriff Leland Puitt reopened his father's files and sought the original evidence from 1920, especially Ezra's journal and the documents from the hidden chamber. But what he found only deepened the mystery. The most important pieces of evidence had already vanished, just like the men who once lived on the Coones farm. The trail of missing evidence surrounding the Coones case grew even murkier, with the revelation that the journals and papers Sheriff Puitt had logged were said to have perished in a courthouse fire in 1924. Oddly enough, the fire damaged only the evidence storage room. Investigators later ruled it arson, but no culprit was ever identified. With Holloway's disappearance in 1928 still unsolved, the land itself seemed to carry a shadow. Gladwell abandoned the venture soon after selling off the cattle operation. The farm sat vacant for years until 1935, when the federal government purchased it under a Depression-era program that expanded the Ozarks National Forest. The cabin Marshfield had built became a way station for rangers rarely used and never permanently staffed. Yet it didn't take long for news stories to attach themselves to the place. In April 1942, Raymond Carter, a Forest Service employee conducting a resource survey, spent 3 nights in the cabin. His notes, still preserved in the Harrison archives, recorded a disturbing entry at 2:15 a.m. on April 17th. Carter wrote that he awoke to scratching noises inside the walls, rhythmic and deliberate, more like coded signals than the random gnawing of rodents. The sounds went on for nearly 45 minutes before stopping without explanation. The following day, Carter explored the property where he found something just as peculiar: 7 circular depressions in the northern fields. They ranged from 2 to 8 feet across, each one perfectly round. Carter noted that they were not randomly scattered, but arranged in a loose semicircle facing north, as if intentionally placed. He sketched the layout in his report. A week later, Maintenance Supervisor Edward Gaines filed his official inspection of the cabin. His report claimed no sign of pests, no entry points, no nests. But he did mention an unexplained cold spot in one corner of the main room and suggested further review when budget permits. Years later, in conversation with Burroughs, Gaines admitted he had withheld something. Behind the northeast wall, he had found a small cavity holding a cloth-wrapped bundle. When he tried to pull it out, he felt a sudden jolt, like an electric shock that left his arm numb for days. He alerted the district ranger, who retrieved the bundle himself and instructed Gaines to stay quiet. Nothing further was written into the records, and the incident was quietly buried. By the early 1950s, the cabin had fallen into disrepair. As part of a modernization initiative in 1953, the Forest Service demolished it. The root cellar, however, was reinforced and left standing for emergency use. During that renovation, workers stumbled onto something not entered in any official file. One of them, Oscar Jenkins, spoke of it years later in a 1962 interview with Burroughs. His account suggested that the cellar still had secrets to give up, secrets that tied back to the long chain of vanishings and unexplained events on the Coones land. When the Forest Service reinforced the old Coones root cellar in 1953, workers stumbled onto something never entered into the official record. Laborer Oscar Jenkins later recalled that while shoring up the walls, they uncovered a rusty tin box wedged behind a beam, deliberately hidden. Inside was a bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth, still remarkably intact. Jenkins swore the handwriting matched samples Burroughs had shown him of Ezra's journals. The pages ranted about something living in the woods, something that could change its form. Ezra had written that it took his mother, then his father, and that it would come for him next. He claimed it needed the blood of his bloodline to remain in this world. According to Jenkins, the site foreman Charles Danning ordered the crew to forget what they had seen and confiscated the box. When Burroughs later tried to verify the story, Danning denied it completely. Records show he resigned suddenly in November 1953, less than a month after the renovation, and relocated to Oregon. Burroughs eventually tracked him down in 1961, but her notes describe the conversation as brief and unsettling. At first hostile, Danning became alarmed when she mentioned the Coones property. "How did you find me? Did they send you?" he reportedly asked before hanging up. He moved again shortly after, leaving no trail. While the papers disappeared into silence, science drew new attention to the property. A 1955 University of Arkansas survey flagged the land for its unusual subterranean features. The circular depressions noted by Carter in 1942 were unlike the irregular sinkholes normally seen in limestone country. This led geologist Dr. Harold Winters to lead a deeper study in 1958 using soil core's ground-penetrating radar and test excavations. His 1959 publication in the Journal of Speleological Studies reported a network of underground chambers 50 to 75 feet below the surface. What stood out was their shape. The structures did not conform to natural karst erosion. Winters controversially suggested that some passages appeared to have been altered or expanded by human hands long before Europeans arrived in the Ozarks. Skeptics dismissed the idea as overinterpretation of unusual geology. But Winters' findings caught the interest of archaeologists studying pre-Columbian cave use. In 1962, Dr. Eliza Montgomery received permission to survey the site. Her field notes archived at the University of Arkansas describe fragments of pottery with decorative patterns not resembling known indigenous styles of the region. Though limited in scope, her work convinced her something was buried in the soil's silence. In 1967, she wrote to Burroughs, "I remain convinced that something significant lies beneath that property, something that predates any recorded human habitation in the region." By then, the Coones farm had shifted from a local ghost story into a riddle that crossed the lines between archaeology, geology, and folklore. What began as the disappearance of one solitary man now seemed rooted in mysteries far older than the county itself. By the mid-1960s, the mystery of the Coones property had shifted from folklore into the realm of academic study. In 1965, geology student Martin Reynolds, while surveying karst formations in Newton County, came upon a massive sinkhole in the northern section of the former Coones farm. His field journal, later archived at the University of Arkansas, described a conical depression about 20 feet across that dropped nearly 50 feet to a ledge before plunging further. What struck Reynolds most was the unnaturally smooth walls, far more polished than typical karst erosion would produce. He made plans to return with proper equipment for a deeper descent. That return came on October 17, 1965. Exactly 45 years to the day after Ezra Coones was first noted missing. Reynolds was joined by fellow student Peter Garrison. Using a rope and radio system, Reynolds descended into the shaft, while Garrison monitored from above. At 75 feet down, Reynolds reported reaching a chamber about 30 feet wide. What he saw there unsettled him: wall formations that were not mineral deposits, but carving symbols etched into stone. He described the chamber as unnaturally cold far below, what surface conditions would suggest, and noted strange acoustics. His words echoed far longer than the dimensions should have allowed. The most startling detail was a circular opening in the chamber floor, not vertical but horizontal, like a tunnel leading deeper into the earth. His last transmission was cut off mid-sentence. "There's something else down here. Looks like... oh God, I think it's before the radio dissolved into static." Garrison reported hearing a noise afterward that he described as like no human voice I have ever heard. When Reynolds failed to respond, Garrison tried to haul him up only to find the rope severed. The end wasn't frayed or cut, it appeared melted or dissolved as though exposed to something corrosive. Panicked, Garrison alerted authorities, and a rescue operation mobilized before nightfall. But before anyone could descend, the shaft collapsed entirely. Where Reynolds had entered just hours earlier, now lay a sealed mass of stone and earth. Attempts to reopen the passage failed. Excavation machinery broke down repeatedly, and reports mentioned strange gas emissions seeping from the rubble. The official line was simple: geological instability caused the collapse. But engineers later consulted by Martha Burroughs questioned that conclusion. They argued that a sudden total cave-in of a shaft that had appeared stable only hours before was highly improbable. For them, as for many in Newton County, Reynolds' disappearance was not an accident, but the latest chapter in a story that stretched back to Ezra Coones, a story of vanishings, fire, hidden rooms, and something beneath the Ozarks that defied explanation. By the late 1960s, the Coones property had become more than a local ghost story. It was a convergence of folklore, geology, and archaeology, with each new discovery deepening the sense that something older than the county itself lay beneath those woods. After Martin Reynolds' disappearance, the University of Arkansas placed a memorial plaque near the sinkhole in 1966, while the Forest Service quietly designated the area off limits. 2 years later, the sinkhole and surrounding acreage were fenced off entirely, cutting off public access under the pretense of safety. Martha Burroughs' last interview connected to the case came in 1967 with Peter Garrison, the only witness to Reynolds' final moments. By then, Garrison had finished his geology degree but abandoned graduate school, retreating to a quiet job as a high school science teacher in Fort Smith. Initially reluctant, he eventually agreed to talk. What he told Burroughs went far beyond the official account. He revealed that before the burst of static, before that unearthly sound, Martin Reynolds had spoken one final phrase over the radio: "The walls are moving." The exact same wording Ezra Coones had used in his journal nearly half a century earlier. Garrison also shared details he'd never disclosed to authorities. Reynolds had been plagued by headaches in the days leading up to the expedition, describing a pressure at the back of his skull, as though something unseen were pressing inward. He had been having recurring dreams of standing inside a circular room covered in shifting symbols. Dreams that mirrored the chamber he would later describe moments before vanishing. And just days before their descent, Reynolds received an anonymous letter. The envelope bore no return address, only his name. Inside was a crude drawing of a circular depression with a small figure drawn for scale, and below it 3 ominous words: "Not in October." Reynolds had brushed it off as a prank, but Garrison told Burroughs he was no longer sure. Driven by his own obsession, Garrison admitted that in the spring of 1966, he returned to the site alone, breaching Forest Service restrictions. By then, the collapse had formed a shallow basin, 3 feet deep, filled with soil unlike anything in the surrounding area. Dark, oily, and barren. "Nothing grows there," he said. "Not even weeds." He took a sample to a chemistry department colleague who found unidentifiable compounds with an unusual molecular structure. Garrison's conclusion to Burroughs was blunt and unwavering. "I'm certain of it. Whatever's under that ground has been taking people for a long time, and I think it's getting stronger." He believed the known disappearances, Ezra in 1920, Holloway in 1928, Reynolds in 1965, were only part of a larger, hidden pattern of vanishings in those woods. Burroughs herself died in 1969. Her lifetime of research boxed up and donated to the Newton County Historical Society. For decades, the papers gathered dust until a revival of local history in the early 2000s led to their rediscovery. In 1971, 2 years after Burroughs' death, a survey team mapping the new Buffalo National River stumbled upon a feature that seemed to echo her work. In a remote area about a mile north of the former Coones property, they found a ring of 12 stone cairns, 50 feet across, arranged with mathematical precision. At the center stood a larger mound, topped with a flat slab, carved with symbols that matched the markings Holloway described in 1928. Dr. William Martinez of the Park Service examined the site, concluding that the cairns were deliberately constructed, but offering no estimate of their age. Weathering and a lack of artifacts made dating impossible. It was a fitting, eerie epilogue. Even after the deaths, the disappearances, and the official investigations had ended, the land itself continued to hint at an ancient and deliberate design patterns carved into stone, etched into soil, and perhaps still waiting beneath the Ozarks. By the early 1970s, the Coones case had drifted from local memory into a strange twilight between folklore and forgotten history. Dr. William Martinez's 1971 survey of the cairn circle north of the property had raised tantalizing possibilities. The symbols carved into the central slab didn't match known indigenous traditions, but might reflect a strain of folk magic once practiced in isolated Ozark communities during the 19th century. He urged further study, but before it could happen, the devastating floods of 1973 buried the site beneath silt and debris. When researchers returned, the cairns were gone, erased by nature or something less easily explained. The mystery briefly resurfaced in 1978 when Ranger Michael Thornton reported finding a lone standing stone nearby, marked with carvings nearly identical to Martinez's sketches. Thornton photographed the stone but failed to record precise coordinates. 2 weeks later, when he brought archaeologists back, the stone had vanished. Thornton soon requested a transfer, explaining in a private letter years later that he was plagued by dreams. He described standing in a circle of stones as something formless and black rose from the earth, whispering words in an unrecognizable tongue. Words he nearly understood. His confession ended with a chilling line. "After what I've seen and heard in those woods, I can't stay." When the Buffalo National River was officially established in 1972, the Coones property was absorbed into its boundaries. The house and cellar site were reclaimed by forest, leaving no trace of habitation. The sinkhole, however, remained sealed off its location, marked only on internal Forest Service maps as hazardous terrain, no entry. Yet stories persisted. In 1982, a group of hikers claimed to have stumbled onto a perfect circle of scorched ground 30 feet across, deep within the restricted zone. They said the soil looked as though it had been seared by extreme heat, though no fire damage was visible in the surrounding woods. Rangers who investigated found nothing but one hiker required medical attention for acute panic and disorientation symptoms that lingered long after. In 1994, the site again drew attention. This time from Dr. Samuel Crawford, a controversial archaeologist with a reputation for chasing fringe theories. Defying Park Service rules, he and a small team attempted to run ground-penetrating radar over the northern section of the land. They were stopped before completing their survey, but not before collecting a fragment of data. Published in a minor journal of alternative archaeology, Crawford's results appeared to show a series of perfectly circular chambers linked by straight passageways about 60 feet underground. Mainstream geologists dismissed the images as distortions of radar equipment interpreting natural cave structures. Crawford, however, insisted until his death in 2001 that the formations were artificial, the work of an unknown culture predating all established North American civilizations. In his final paper, Crawford drew the lines even more boldly. He argued that the Coones property was not an isolated oddity, but part of a network of power sites scattered across the Ozarks. He tied the pattern to unexplained disappearances, Ezra Coones in 1920, Vincent Holloway in 1928, Martin Reynolds in 1965, and linked them to dozens of missing persons cases stretching back more than a century. To Crawford, the pattern was unmistakable. Whatever lurked beneath the Newton County hills was not a natural feature of stone and soil, but something ancient, deliberate, and still active. By the mid-2000s, the Coones property, long folded into the Buffalo National River, had become a flashpoint for two very different worlds. Government scientists quietly logging odd data, and fringe researchers convinced the land concealed something extraordinary, while Dr. Samuel Crawford's claims about a pre-Columbian power site network were dismissed by mainstream archaeologists. They drew steady attention from paranormal investigators and conspiracy forums. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, small, unauthorized expeditions repeatedly breached the fences, prompting the Park Service to increase patrols and install heavier barriers around the restricted zone. Even official surveys began to produce anomalies. In 2005, biologist Dr. Laura Chen, conducting a routine resource management survey, documented something no one had ever reported on paper-concentric rings of vegetation radiating out from a center point near the old Coones homestead. Within the rings, plant species changed sharply, and at the very center, spanning nearly 100 feet, growth was stunted and deformed, even in common species. Soil samples from this zone showed abnormal mineral content and pH values unlike anything in the surrounding forest. Chen suggested underground hydrological features might be redistributing nutrients, but admitted the pattern was strange. Stranger still, GPS units and digital cameras frequently malfunctioned inside the rings, but only when pointed toward the center, as if some directional field disrupted their electronics. Then, in 2008, Newton County experienced an unusual cluster of small earthquakes. None above magnitude 2.5, but concentrated within a mile of the Coones site. Seismologist Dr. James Harden analyzed the data and concluded the tremors looked more like subsidence events than tectonic movement, hinting at cave collapses or underground structural shifts. A 2009 follow-up survey revealed that the subterranean layout had indeed changed. Some passages had collapsed while others appeared to have expanded. Most strikingly, the perfectly circular chambers Crawford had identified in his controversial 1994 radar images no longer appeared at all, as though they had either fallen in or been somehow filled. The official records of the Coones case, Ezra's disappearance, Holloway's vanishing, 8 years later, Martin Reynolds' fatal descent in 1965, form only a skeleton of dates and names. The living mystery resides in the gaps, the missing evidence, contradictory testimonies, and inexplicable patterns documented by people who often wanted nothing to do with notoriety. In 2010, during digitization of old county records, a Jasper court clerk made one final discovery that tied the whole century-long story back to its beginning. Tucked inside a property deed book from the 1920s was a sealed yellowed envelope containing a note apparently handwritten by Sheriff Milton Pwitt, dated November 5, 1920, just days after the fire destroyed the Coones home. In the note, Pwitt admitted to finding something he deliberately kept out of the official file. While checking for hot spots in the ashes of Ezra's bedroom, he and a deputy named Thompson uncovered a metal box that had survived the fire. Inside was a journal, older than Ezra's, likely his father's from the dates. Most pages were too damaged to read, but one remained intact. It bore a drawing of a large circle surrounded by smaller ones like a target, and next to it, words scrawled in what looked like dried blood. It comes through the circles when October thins the veil. Thompson wanted to keep investigating, Pwitt wrote, but I told him to leave it be. Some things shouldn't be disturbed. That brief hidden note, buried for 90 years, offered no answers. Only confirmation of what so many suspected: whatever haunted the Coones property was not new. It had been there all along, moving beneath the hills, waiting for October. By the time the sealed note from Sheriff Milton Pewitt surfaced in 2010, the Coones mystery had accumulated nearly a century of disappearances, oddities, and suppressed evidence. The note, its paper ink and handwriting confirmed by experts, carried a chilling final warning. I'm putting this note here in case something happens to me. If you're reading this, be warned. Stay away from the North Field. Some still argue it's a modern hoax, but its contents fit seamlessly with the secret details Pewitt had already withheld from his reports. The rediscovery of the note spurred a fresh wave of local interest. In 2012, the Newton County Historical Society convened a panel of archaeologists, geologists, and folklorists to evaluate the accumulated lore and evidence. No consensus emerged, but the event cemented the Coones case as a defining piece of regional history, a story where the documentary record ends and legend begins. Then, in 2015, a revelation shifted the narrative once again. Dr. Eliza Montgomery, the archaeologist who had briefly surveyed the property in 1962, broke her decades-long silence. In an interview with a regional historical journal, she admitted she had left something crucial out of her official report. During her survey, she and her team found an entrance sealed with fitted stones weighing hundreds of pounds, leading to what she believed was a constructed chamber, not a natural cave. We documented it, she said, but didn't open it. That would have required resources we didn't have and permissions we couldn't get. She claimed she submitted the photographs and coordinates separately to her department head, but they were never acknowledged and later misplaced. When asked why she'd kept the secret for more than 50 years, Montgomery replied simply, "Fear at first. I was told discussing unauthorized findings would end my career." Even after she was established, she said it was easier to move on than to reopen that door. Yet she never forgot the symbols carved into the ceiling stones, the same designs appearing in every account of the Coones property from Ezra's time to the present. Montgomery's claim cannot be verified. She left behind no surviving documentation, and the site had changed dramatically over the decades. She died in 2017, taking any remaining details with her. Still, her story matched the patterns in the record hidden chambers, sealed passages, symbols carved in secret places. Even today, whispers persist in Jasper. Locals still talk of livestock that refuse to graze in certain patches, hikers who become disoriented near the old property line, and strange sounds in the woods north of town, especially in October, when, as the old saying goes, the veil between worlds thins. Jake Thornton, a licensed guide for the Buffalo National River, tells visitors only what can be documented, that people vanished here, that the geology is unusual, and that parts of the land are restricted for safety. I don't embellish, he says, but I don't dismiss it either. Something happened there. Whether it was something mundane that got exaggerated or something truly unexplainable, I couldn't say. Yet even he has his own story. In October 2018, while marking a trail about half a mile from the restricted area, Thornton heard someone whispering his name. Not loudly, but in a way that carried through the trees. He called back, but no one answered. Suddenly, the air turned cold like stepping into a walk-in freezer, and the forest fell silent. No birds, no insects, not even the rustling of leaves, though he could see the branches swaying in the breeze. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then the sounds returned, leaving only the echo of his breath and the uneasy certainty that just for that moment he had stepped into the heart of the Coones legend. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the woods returned to normal. Jake Thornton, a man who had spent his entire life guiding hunters, hikers, and scientists through the Buffalo River country, said he'd never experienced anything like that moment before or since. It was an ordinary October day. But something had brushed against the edges of the ordinary. A silence, a chill, a whisper that knew his name. Science offers explanations for pieces of the puzzle. Sinkholes are common in karst terrain. underground acoustics can distort sound. Isolation, stress, and folklore can prime the mind to see patterns or hear voices that aren't there. Coincidences, however eerie, can still be coincidences. Yet the questions persist. What did Ezra Coones discover in his lonely investigations? What exactly was the phenomenon he discussed with RM, the man who later appeared as Robert Marshfield to claim his property? What were the markings? Holloway found carved into beams and trees. And what did Martin Reynolds see in that chamber 75 feet below the surface before the rope went slack? In 2019, new technology offered a glimpse beneath the legend. Using high-resolution 3D imaging and advanced ground-penetrating radar, Dr. Rebecca Winters of the University of Arkansas mapped the subsurface of the former Coones property. Her team found a labyrinth of caves and voids, most explainable by natural karst processes, but not all. At approximately 70 feet below the surface, Winters wrote in her published findings, "We identified structures that display regularities, not typical of natural cave formation. Perfectly circular chambers linked by straight passages at consistent angles. Nature tends to be irregular." She stopped short of claiming artificial construction, but called for further investigation. Even more unsettling, Winters' data showed rapid changes over time. Passages open in earlier surveys had collapsed or filled. New openings had appeared elsewhere. The subterranean landscape is constantly changing, she observed. But the rate and pattern of change here are unusual. The pattern above ground was even harder to ignore. From the disappearance of Ezra Coones in 1920 to Holloway in 1928 to Reynolds in 1965, the same motifs recurred. October isolation circles, symbols, and sudden silence. Park Service records show that between 1972 and 2020, 7 hikers were reported missing within 5 miles of the former Coones property. 5 were later found disoriented but unharmed, unable to explain where they had been or why their watches had stopped. 2 were never found at all, both in October. Both people who had spoken of visiting the site because of its legend. Shortly before her death, Martha Burroughs summarized a lifetime of research. In a final note, "I no longer believe we are dealing with murder or madness in any conventional sense. Whatever happened at the Coones property transcends ordinary criminal investigation. Some secrets are buried too deep, literally and figuratively, to be uncovered by conventional means. And perhaps some secrets should remain buried." Today, the Buffalo National River draws thousands of visitors who hike its trails and float its waters, unaware they're passing near the epicenter of one of Arkansas's strangest mysteries. Fewer still hear the whispers said to rise from the woods on October nights, whispers almost like words, almost like warnings. Dr. Thomas Blackwood, a professor of folklore at the University of Arkansas, says this is precisely why the Coones story endures. It weaves together documented fact, the disappearances, the unusual geological features, the recurring symbols, with the darker threads of folklore that run through these mountains, he explains. Indigenous legends from before European settlement speak of places where the ground breathes of circles where the worlds touch. They're often associated with vanishings or transformations. These mountains are ancient. Then he pauses, as if weighing his next words. And some stories are older than we think. They've been inhabited for thousands of years, and stories accumulate in these mountains like sediment layer upon layer. What happened to Ezra Coones and the others may not be an isolated mystery, but a modern chapter in an older narrative, one that predates maps, deeds, or even written language. In 2120, during pandemic-related closures of the Buffalo National River, remote monitoring equipment placed near the restricted zone recorded something new. Seismographs picked up micro-tremors too subtle for human senses occurring nightly between 2 and 3 a.m. Audio sensors captured sounds below the range of normal hearing, rhythmic and structured. When filtered and amplified, the recordings showed repeated patterns like fragments of a coded message. The monitoring report is just the latest entry in a long ledger of anomalies. Forest Service files show that in October 2017, rangers found a breach in the fencing inside the restricted area. A backpack, water bottle, and flashlight lay neatly on the ground, seemingly recently abandoned. No missing person report ever matched the gear. Inside the pack was a journal describing its unnamed owner's fascination with the Coones legend and a determination to uncover what lay beneath the circles. The final entry, dated October 17th, made it past the fence just before sunset. The ground feels different here, almost vibrating. Found a depression 20 feet across, perfectly circular. Soil at the center looks disturbed, like something digging from below, setting camera traps before dark. If I'm right, if the pattern holds, something will happen around midnight. The walls between worlds are thinnest now. No camera traps were recovered. No owner was ever identified. The Ozarks kept their secret. And in Jasper, old-timers still advise against going too far north when the October winds rise and the veil between worlds grows thin. In the archives of the Newton County Historical Society, among Martha Burroughs's meticulous notes, lies a single sheet transcribed from what may be Ezra Coones' final journal entry. More complete than the often quoted, "It's in the walls," it reads. It's in the walls now. I can hear it moving, searching. The symbols Father carved only slow it down. They don't stop it anymore. Perhaps they never did. I understand now why Mother wasted away, why Father's heart gave out. It wasn't illness or age. It was the slow drain of whatever it takes from us. The Marshfield letters confirm what I've suspected. It needs our family, our bloodline, to maintain its presence here. Why us, I still don't know. Something in our veins it finds sustaining. Tomorrow I'll set the trap. The clothing on the bed should buy me time to reach the north field and collapse the entrance. If I succeed, let this record stand as warning. If I fail, God help whoever comes after me. The circles are thinning. October calls it forth. Whether these words are truly Ezra's or the invention of a later hand is impossible to prove. But they echo across a century of strange events. Disappearances, sealed chambers, symbols carved in stone, whispers at night, and ground that trembles as if alive. A legacy of mystery that continues to haunt the shadowed hollows of the Ozarks, where circles wait and October always comes.